Welcome to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. Now entering the grid. Here are your hosts, Thomas and Jeremiah.
Welcome back to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. We're your hosts, Thomas
and Jeremiah.
Jeremiah, today we are doing Up to Date in the world of Formula One.
Okay.
So I thought that we would go through the first 3 races of the season, kind of update everybody on where we're at, maybe our thoughts on them. And then let's dive back into our prediction special that we had a couple weeks back. Let's renovate those a little bit because they're a little off. And then let's actually go into the world of F1 Reddit, and let's find some folks that have been commenting on this season and maybe debate their points and see what the commenters are saying. Okay, so as we sit right now in real time, we are still sitting in the break between the Australian Grand Prix and the, what's next? The Azerbaijan Baku Grand Prix. There was supposed to be a Chinese Grand Prix in the middle of this, so that it was only like a 2-week break and a 1-week break. That has been postponed and then canceled. So we're in like this 28-day break period right now. But the first 3 races of the season, you had Bahrain, Saudi Arabia or Jeddah, and then the Australian GP. Looking at the Bahrain Grand Prix, I think we learned a ton from that race that we weren't ready for. We learned that 1, Red Bull is still awesome.
100%.
2, where did Aston Martin come from?
Oh, yeah.
And then I think we started to see the battle for 2nd, 3rd, and 4th in the constructor standings between Aston Martin, Ferrari, and Mercedes, all come from Bahrain.
Yeah, and it's kind of, here again, like we mentioned in past episodes, it's always weird to remind yourself that Aston Martin finished in 7th, 8th in the constructors? 7th?
I think 7th, yeah.
Yeah, and now they're an arguable fight for 2nd.
Yeah.
So
if they had a car that can compete with Red Bull, we'd say they have a shot at number 1. But I think as we'll get into some of these other races, I don't think it's competitive with the Red Bull.
No, until we see some updates.
It's competitive with everybody else. Bahrain went on kind of without a hitch. I think, again, we learned a lot about where the constructors were going to stand, but I think we had a lot of questions after Bahrain. Would Aston Martin be able to hold that? Was it a fluke? Was it, technical issues with the other drivers? As we move into the second race of the year in Jeddah, our boy Max Verstappen starts in 19th or 20th.
Yeah.
And he has to work his way back up the field. I think they had 3 or 4 safety cars in that race, which definitely helped him. But who ends up winning the Jeddah Grand Prix?
Sergio Perez.
Yep. So Sergio took first, Max took second, and then Fernando Alonso took third. That was the race where it's kind of that, because that race is so full on speed, right? It's like 70-something% of the time they're full throttle on Jeddah. The Aston Martin just couldn't keep pace with the Red Bull.
No, and that's why you get such a discrepancy, like a 20-second difference between first and the arguable second, which was Aston Martin at the time, even though it's third. But the 2 Red Bulls were just so far ahead of everybody else.
Max Verstappen he was doing that thing that he did last year where like they'll start the race by following the leaders, and then every couple of laps, and here goes Max with another overtake.
Right.
As he's just whipping through the field.
I wanted to tack on to the Bahrain Grand Prix. This is where we learned that McLaren...
Oh,
exactly. Their durability just might not be up to par with the rest of the teams, and so you had Oscar Piastri retiring and Lando finishing last out of the cars that actually finished. Going into the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix,
he was lapped twice.
Yeah, exactly. But
he did have a tech issue with the car.
He had 5 pit stops.
Yeah.
So there's that.
Had to keep getting air put in the car.
Yeah. And then in the second race, the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, this is where we saw, unfortunately, the first demise of an Aston Martin car as Lance Stroll does not finish the race.
So we were talking before the podcast about we're going to get to our predictions here in a minute, where we thought they would be versus where they are, and we can save this for then. But Aston Martin, the biggest question mark. Okay, you went from a bottom feeder, a backmarker team, to competing for the second constructor spot. Yes, your car is fast. Can it hold up to the rigors of a 22 race schedule?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's honestly a question that they've been asking of every driver, every car for this season, or not just this season, when they started going up into the 20s for races. Ever since we saw that, which was, 2019, something like that. Anyway, we started to see these cars, whether or not they're going to be able to last the full length of the season. We'll start seeing drivers taking penalties because their parts are going bad and they're going to have to replace them. My question is Aston Martin's car going to last the whole thing, or are they going to end up in the same scenario as the cars last year, taking grid penalties at the end of the year?
I think that'll be telling as we approach like the third way mark through the season.
Yeah.
Maybe race 6 to 8. We'll start to see a lot of those teams start to get penalties for new components. And if they're one of them, they're fast. Aston Martin is fast, but I don't think they can rip through the field like the Red Bull can. So if you have an Aston Martin starting in 20th like Max did in Jeddah, you're not going to get second.
No, but if we take Red Bull out of the equation altogether and made the top teams a fight between Mercedes, Aston Martin, and Ferrari, who takes the first spot?
That's what we're going to find out. We've talked Red Bull we've gotten through the first 2 races of the year, and we've talked Red Bull, we've talked Aston Martin, we've talked a little Ferrari. One of the big names missing is Mercedes. Now, going back to Bahrain, Mercedes had Hamilton finish 5 and George Russell finish 7. Okay, we thought that they might kind of go back and forth throughout the season and be pretty on level with each other in terms of skill. You go to Saudi Arabia, though, and they go 4-5.
Right, and now this time with George in 4th.
Right.
So kind of playing on to what you said earlier with this trading back and forth game.
I think that number 2 spot is still wide open for anybody to take. Moving into Australia, just an absolute dumpster fire of an F1 Grand Prix. Awesome. I mean, there's definitely the races that we like that are crash heavy and red flagged and safety card and all that. But there was a lot of it in Australia.
Yeah, and when you have 8 cars not finish the race, it kind of throws a hitch in the standings a little bit. Yep. So you have names kind of like, I mean, obviously he's my guy, so I hate saying this, but guys like Nico Hülkenberg and Haas getting all the way up in 7th, taking home 6 points, when in reality, if everybody was in that race, probably would have finished either outside of the points or maybe 10th.
If you've just picked up on the F1 season or you haven't watched any of the races so far, highly worth it to go back and skim through the Australian Grand Prix. F1 TV, a great investment. It's like $60 to $80 a year, depending on your package that you get. They do a condensed version of the race, like a no huddle version of a football game.
Yeah, like the race in 30, I think is what it's called.
It just shows you the action points. But watching the whole race would take a while because it was red flag for a long time and all that. But you will see the chaos that was caused every single time there was a red flag and a race restart, where people got points that in any other race weekend would not have been in positions to get points. You mentioned some of them, but let's go through the top 10. You had Verstappen finish 1, Hamilton 2, Alonso 3. Okay, interesting, right? Mercedes starting to figure it out. Aston Martin still up there, obviously, with the top dogs. Then you go Stroll, Perez, Norris. Norris, I think, is the first wild card because, as we saw from the first 2 races of the year, McLaren, no good.
Right.
And then you get some real curveballs. Hülkenberg 7, Piastri the rookie 8, Zhou Guanyu 9, and Yuki Tsunoda 10.
Right, and if you actually think about this, Zhou Guanyu isn't finishing in 9th. Yuki Tsunoda maybe 10th. Oscar Piastri definitely not in the top 10. Lando Norris not in the top 10. Maybe 10th, maybe 9th. We'll talk about that later on. Nico Hülkenberg, that's definitely the biggest wild card. I love the guy. I love Haas. They're one of my favorite teams, but they're just not top 10 material just yet, in my opinion.
You had Charles Leclerc, George Russell, the 2 Alpines, Esteban Ocon and Pierre Gasly, all taken out of the race. So those were all legit points contenders.
Yeah.
And then you had Carlos Sainz finish the race, but obviously get booted from 4th down to 12th because of a penalty.
Right. So if you put Pierre Gasly back in the race, Esteban Ocon back in the race, George Russell and Charles Leclerc, and Carlos doesn't pick up that penalty, we now see Hülkenberg, Piastri, Zhou Guanyu, Tsunoda all out of the top 10.
So looking ahead just a little bit before we get to the team totals, we have Azerbaijan, Baku, as it's known, the Baku City Circuit up next. That's at the end of April. And then you go into Miami. Obviously, Baku plays well to the powerful cars, the cars that can lead down a straightaway really fast because it does have that 2 or 3 mile straightaway for the last sector. I think Red Bull runs away with that. I think the interesting thing to look forward to is who takes second in terms of constructors. Is it Aston Martin or is it Mercedes?
Yeah, and you know how I feel about Azerbaijan. It's one of my favorite tracks out there, if not my favorite. The fact that half of the turns are 90-degree angle turns is just wild to me.
The castle turn, ripping up
and
through.
The castle too, where you have to rip up into this little alley that's super narrow and try and wiggle your way through it to get to the other side. And that, I believe, spills into a couple more turns, which leads you into the straightaway. Yep. The super, super long back straight that takes you back to the start-finish line.
That's where you're getting full throttle in an F1 car.
Right, and before that, whenever you're doing the fast left-right, or sometimes you can take it full throttle, sometimes you have to back out, depending on how confident you're feeling in that moment.
Do you have some wing damage?
Definitely stuff like that is going to be interesting to see, especially when you come in talks of, like, with Williams, how Williams has a very fast car, but maybe not so technical in the corners. So
Alex Albon.
Exactly. What are we going to see from the Williams car in Azerbaijan?
We didn't talk about that in the Australian Grand Prix, but Alex Albon was in 6th before he wrecked out.
Yeah, he was
6 or 7?
Was it 6 or 7?
He was in 6 for a while.
He qualified very high.
And it's because the Williams is fast, legitimately. Okay, looking at the season totals, just to kind of recap where we stand today before we go into our past predictions and updating them. You have Max 1, Sergio 2. I think that's,
understandable.
From the start of the season, we can kind of see that playing out that way. Fernando Alonso 3, obviously a big wild card for 2023. Maybe not a surprise if you were somebody that watched testing, like Jeremiah was very invested in.
I called it.
And then you have Lewis Hamilton 4, Carlos Sainz 5, Lance Stroll 6, and then George Russell 7. Everybody else after that only has points really in a single race with the exception of Pierre Gasly, but he doesn't have a lot of points. So we're seeing a lot of curveballs this year. Red Bull, take them out of the picture because we've talked about this ever since we started the podcast. You can't come into the season necessarily always watching the winner like in every other sport. You're watching all the other position battles.
Right. It's important to respect what's going on at the top of the grid because right now we are writing and currently in the story of Max Verstappen. This is how long will he go on top. This is who's going to be the first person to fight him and bring the fight to him from a different team. This is he going to beat his teammate? These are the storylines that are being told right now from the front of the grid. But if you want the action, if you want the fighting, if you want the drama, and honestly, if you want the crashes, it's probably going to start looking at the cars after Red Bull.
And that ties back to kind of what we were mentioning whenever we were like, Lewis Hamilton obviously dominated in the Mercedes for a long time, but then you had 2.5 years of Max Verstappen being a legitimate contender until he finally, took over and claimed that. So who's going to be the next in line to do this to Red Bull?
Right.
Looking at the constructor standings, Red Bull 1, Aston Martin 2, Mercedes 3, Ferrari 4, McLaren 5. I think the biggest shock there, aside from Aston Martin being really high, Ferrari being low, Alpine now suddenly a 6th-place team. We are only 3 races in. I think a lot of this is going to, just like they used to say in the races, whenever you had the cars starting out of order, this will all kind of straighten itself out as the race goes on.
Yeah.
You got to look at the season kind of like a race. It's got a long way to go.
Right. But here's my problem with this. When we're talking about McLaren being in that 5 spot, Alpine being in that 6 spot, McLaren should not be in the top 5. They shouldn't.
No.
So the fact that Alpine is sitting in the 6th spot is very worrying because that tells me that not only is McLaren having horrible reliability problems, Alpine's not looking any hotter.
No.
Now this is where it does get a little bit iffy because technically you could say if Pierre Gasly didn't take out Esteban Ocon in the Australian Grand Prix, then we would see Alpine over McLaren. However, that is not what happened. And you have to go by what actually happens, not by what the books say should happen.
I wish that Australian Grand Prix was like in the middle of the season where we knew where things were because we really only have 2 good races of data to go off of because you kind of have to throw things out of the book for Australia. There were so many red flags, so many stoppages, so many safety cars that they didn't race.
Oh, sure. I mean, if we're talking about how confusing it is based on the knowledge that we've been given so far, we knew Red Bull was going to be number 1. We knew that. 2, 3, and 4, obviously Aston Martin, the surprise. But like we had talked about, Ferrari, Mercedes, Aston Martin, that's kind of your you can call it middle of the pack, but in reality, it's kind of the front of the grid, and Red Bull is just its own separate category. After those 4 teams, though, it's kind of up in the air. I mean, McLaren and Alpine kind of 1-1 right now with how unreliable the car is, and we know it's faster than the rest of the grid, but everybody else past that, Haas, Alfa Romeo, AlphaTauri, Williams, you could throw a dart, land on any one of them, it'd be the exact same.
So with that little conversation on who we think will go where, let's move into our predictions. And let's update these because they weren't good. I mean, they were okay, but we had some big misses, I think.
Yeah, and you'll have that whenever you're trying to decide where a season's going to fall with no prior knowledge. But
and you have a constructor like Aston. This isn't a normal year. You don't have a constructor go from 7 to 2. We've never seen that in our time. So we started watching races live in 2022, but we went back to Drive to Survive in 2018, right? And we've watched a lot of those races since then. We've read up on the history on them. You don't have 7 to 2.
No, teams don't make that kind of dramatic jump.
Okay, we're not going to go through all of our entire predictions. I will put them on the screen. So if you're somebody watching on YouTube, 1, thank you, and 2, you can see our past predictions. But we'll do a little cross comparison here between the top 10 drivers where we think they should be now versus where we thought they were, and the top 5 constructors. You want me to kick us off?
Yeah, let's kick it off, but let's start down at 10. I want to build up.
Okay, so here are my predictions going forward. And again, right now on the screen, you'll see the past predictions, but we'll start rolling in the new ones. Number 10, I have Lando Norris. I had him at 8 in my initial predictions, but I go Lando Norris. McLaren clearly not where we thought they would be. I did heavily debate putting Valtteri Bottas in the 10 spot.
I don't know how I feel about that. And the reason why is because I love Valtteri for beating everybody else that's behind that, but I still don't see the McLaren car being worse than the Alfa Romeo.
I'll say the reason I almost put Valtteri in 10 because it seems like he almost finishes every race between the 9 spot and the 11 spot.
Okay.
And so if you're constantly getting 1 or 2 points, that's where you're going to finish.
I mean, yeah, you nickel and dime your way all the way to 10th.
Okay, I'll run through the rest of mine. We don't have to comment on all of them. So Norris at 10, Ocon at 9, Leclerc at 8.
Whoa.
Keep going. I'm sorry, Charles. I really am, man. For clarity, I put Charles at 2 in my initial predictions. He's now at 8. Lance Stroll, 7. Carlos Sainz, 6. Lewis Hamilton, 5. George Russell, 4. And then chalk the rest of the way, Alonso, 3. Perez, 1. Perez, 2. Verstappen, 1.
Okay. Quick comments. 1, you still have Russell over Hamilton.
I do. So in my initial predictions, I put George Russell at 4. He was the first Mercedes behind Verstappen, Leclerc, and Sainz. And then I put Hamilton at 6. And I got a lot of crap for putting Hamilton at 6. Guess what? Ain't too far off, am I? Based on where we stand today, he is currently in 4th. We've got a long way to go. People thought he was going to win another championship.
Whatever. Sometimes you got to create controversy.
But yeah, so 1, 2, 3, I go with the current season standings. I think Red Bull's too dominant, and I think Fernando Alonso can really use that Aston Martin car. Even if it's not the most dominant car on the grid, he's got it figured out very early on. I think George Russell is still I'm not going to say the better driver, but I think he can maneuver his way through an F1 race in his current situation better than Lewis Hamilton can. So I have him finishing 1 spot higher than Hamilton. And then I don't have the Ferraris until 6 and 8.
Yeah, that's the one that's really rough.
Whereas before I had the Ferraris at 2 and 3.
Not only do you have them out of the top 5, you have them separated by somebody, and you have the Ferrari number 2 driver over the arguable number 1.
Yep, and that kind of matches up with your initial projections as well. So again, we'll have those on the screen, but the biggest takeaways are Verstappen still winning, Alonso making his way into the top 3, and then the Ferraris just completely wetting the bed and just moving out of the top 5, which they could figure it out. I just haven't seen any indication that that's happening yet.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to argue with that one. I guess I'll give you it.
All right, what do you got?
Starting at number 10, I've got Esteban Ocon. Fair. Number 9, Lando Norris. Number 8, Charles Leclerc.
Oh, no, he matches.
Yeah.
We're both going 8.
Yeah. Lance Stroll, number 7. I have him at 7 as well. Carlos Sainz, 6. I have him. Wow, that's really weird. I also have Carlos Sainz at 6.
Splitting the Ferraris.
Yeah. George Russell. I've got him in the not only top 5, but I have him at 5. So we have Russell and Hamilton in the same spot, but I have them flipped. So number 4 for me is Lewis Hamilton. I have him having a way better season than he had last year as he has more comfort in the car. Granted, it's still not the car that he wants. It's completely different than how he likes to drive, but he's making do with the situation.
Does he win a race?
Coming in at number 3, I've got Sergio Perez.
You can't sidestep that. Not like that, man.
I don't know, man. At first, I had him just for fun.
He got second last race.
He did. But here's the problem. I don't see Lewis Hamilton winning a race unless something dire happens to Red Bull.
I think it could. If you have a Red Bull, the Red Bull's DNF like they did last year in Bahrain, I think he gets a race win.
I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm saying that it is a very small chance.
Yeah. Because you're also going to have Alonso competing. And
Right. And we also live in an era where when the Red Bulls have problems, they still get 1-2. And they're still, 20 seconds up on everybody else?
When Max starts in 20th, he still gets second.
With the fastest lap.
It's pretty awesome.
And he had problems. Coming in at number 3, like I said, Sergio Perez. I have him being split from the other Red Bull by Fernando Alonso coming in with number 2. And then obviously the number 1 spot will go to Max Verstappen.
So our bottom 6 through 10 kind of line up fairly well. A little bit of movement here or there. But my biggest question comes in that Alonso splitting the Red Bulls. Here's my theory, and I'd like your thoughts. The Red Bull car itself, take the drivers out of the equation, is way better than the Aston Martin car and every other car in the grid.
By far.
So you are now betting on either Alonso's skill or the failure of Sergio Perez to dominate for him to be split away from Max.
I don't think it's so much the failure of Sergio Perez. I feel like it's the failure of Red Bull to stay within the cost cap of the previous year. I think that where this is going to fall and where this is actually going to be seen is later on in the year when Red Bull runs out of wind tunnel time. No more development. Meanwhile, Aston Martin is still developing. Mercedes is still developing because they don't have those penalties. Because not only are they going to get the big hit for taking the first spot where they're let's see. I forget what the percentage is, but I know that since they got first in the Constructors, they're going to have a giant deficit in wind tunnel time.
Didn't they lose like 60% or something?
No, it's not. I don't think it's that drastic. I could be wrong, but it's something drastic.
It was big number.
And then you tack on the top, which is going over the budget cap. So now they're going to have an even bigger wind tunnel testing problem.
This might not be something that we know because I don't know. There are limitations on wind tunnel testing. Can they just save that time that they do have for whenever they want?
I don't know. I feel like right now they're going full throttle wind testing as if they don't have any kind of problem. And my theory is that eventually it's going to reach a point to where they're either going to have to back off drastically or run out of time completely.
So like my thought is if they're so far ahead right now, like they're beating people by 20, 25 seconds a race, can they just say, we're good right now. We don't need to develop.
I do, but here's where it gets difficult because what if in the next few races after that we start to see a resurgence of Mercedes or Aston Martin slowly closing the gap? And now here Red Bull is sitting ducks because if they resume all of that, they now have to wait until they can get a new part to bring because they haven't been doing any of that in these past few races. They've just been sitting and waiting.
So your theory is, Max and Sergio probably dominate the first half of the year, but as we approach the kind of crunch time for when cars have to really perform and when you start getting into the kind of dog days of the F1 season, the Aston Martin is still going to be, hot. It's still going to be going.
I think it's going to be kicking strong. Yeah, okay. I think that they bring upgrades throughout the whole season to keep their pace current, if not better, to where they're closing that gap with Red Bull. And I don't think Red Bull brings as many updates or upgrades this year.
Okay. Last kind of interesting note, we both have Ocon in the top 10 over Pierre Gasly.
I feel like this might sound bad. I feel like that's kind of self-explanatory.
Yeah, but at the same time, if you watch Drive to Survive, boy, Alpine thought Pierre Gasly was the next greatest thing. Lying through their teeth, by the way, because they really wanted Oscar Piastri.
Oh, the whole time.
But I never really looked at Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon as being that different. We talked about them in our predictions episode as being like the most average, the most middle-of-the-road drivers. So, if we had started the season a little bit differently and instead of, Ocon being 12 and Pierre Gasly being 14, maybe we flipped that. I don't know. Hey, everyone. Thomas here, co-host of the Turn 1 podcast. If you're currently listening to this episode, awesome, thank you. You can also find us on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at Turn One Podcast. We will be posting full-length episodes, highlights, and clips on those 3 channels. You can also find us on Twitter at TRN1 Podcast, as well as Facebook, Turn One. Finally, we have an email set up for everyone, trn1podcast@gmail.com. Please feel free to send us any comments, suggestions, or questions you might have. Just like the podcast, we are looking to grow and learn and become even bigger fans of the sport of Formula One. With that, we'll get back to it. Okay, let's look at a little bit of constructors here. This is where we're all over the board. We can give the full predictions on these. My initial predictions for the constructors were Ferrari,
Yikes.
Red Bull,
Yikes.
Mercedes, Alpine, McLaren. I will clarify the reason I put Ferrari at 1, in case you missed it, because I had Charles Leclerc 2 and Carlos Sainz 3. And I thought they would steal enough points, Charles would get enough wins, and Carlos would be consistently beating Sergio, that they would make up the gap and beat Red Bull. That ain't happening. Not even close to happening.
No, as Red Bull approaches almost 100 points over Ferrari.
So my new predictions are as follows. I'll start at 5. 5, Alpine. 4, Ferrari. They go from 1 to 4.
Jeez.
3, Aston Martin. 2, Mercedes. 1, Red Bull.
Okay. Before I even touch my list, where did you have Aston Martin?
I had Aston Martin at 6 originally.
Yeah,
that
I
is
know.
1 spot higher than last year.
I just wanted you to repeat it.
I thought other teams were kind of sandbagging during testing, and I thought they weren't showing all their cards, and I thought Aston Martin was. I was wrong. They were all showing everything, and that played out in the first 3 races of the year. So I think your next question is, why do I have Mercedes beating Aston Martin?
See, that would be my question. Actually, you know what? Go ahead. Let's hear it.
Because you kind of agree. Well, not agree, but you kind of see it, right?
I see it.
Mercedes started the season. I'm going to go pull these up so I have the right list. But Mercedes started the season rough in Bahrain, obviously finishing 5-7. I say that's rough. That's, for the first race of the season, it's a marker. But then they go 4-5 in Saudi Arabia. And then in Australia, Lewis Hamilton gets 2, and then Russell is one of the DNFs.
Okay.
The fact that Lewis could get 2, and the fact that they improved in race 2 pretty significantly, that's a lot of points difference between 5 and 7 and whatever they got in that race. I think kind of like your point you were making on Aston Martin holding maybe the car performance edge, not over Red Bull, but more competitive with Red Bull as the season goes on. I think Mercedes has a history of just dialing things in, and I think they're going to do that. And I think Russell and Hamilton are going to get consistent points, and it is the big kicker is who in this situation.
In terms of what, for the championship?
If I'm talking Russell,
Fernando Alonso.
no.
Oh, it's Lance Stroll, because what are his points going to matter in the grand scheme of things?
Correct. I think Alonso's consistently going to get second or third in most races.
Okay.
But I think that Lance Stroll is always going to get 6 or lower. And you're talking about exponential points here.
Yeah.
So if you have the Mercedes getting 2, 3, 4 every race, and then you have Aston Martin getting 2, 3, 4, and then 6, 7, 8, Mercedes is going to win.
Okay. I think that's a good segue into my list. I'll go ahead and give you my list. Number 5, McLaren. 4, Ferrari.
Okay.
3, Aston Martin. 2, Mercedes, and 1, Red Bull.
Hey!
Yeah. So that's why I was about to say something after you said your list, but I was like, you know what? I want to hear your reasonings first. So
Wow. I didn't think you'd do that.
Here's what I feel, because you're right on the money. Where Lance Stroll's points gonna matter in the grand scheme of things. So if you listen to my drivers' championship standings, I had 2 Alonso, and then Mercedes doesn't enter the picture until 4 and 5, Hamilton, Russell. But the rest of Aston Martin doesn't enter the picture until 7 with Stroll. So if that plays out, I feel that with Hamilton and Russell finishing 4 and 5, they'll get enough points to bunny hop right on over Aston Martin taking that number 2 spot. Now, to your point, when you were talking about them dialing it in, that's exactly what I'm talking about here. Mercedes has a history of dialing it in as the season goes on. Now, we didn't get to see that so much last year because their car was terrible, but they're making changes. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I think it's at the 5th race of this season, they're bringing a whole new upgrade package. And if that's the case, we don't know what to expect. We don't know if this is going to solve their problems of being a 3rd team in the Constructors' Cup to now fighting with Red Bull for the number 1 spot. We don't know. So from that perspective alone, it's just utter mystery.
I don't disagree. Look, Aston Martin could very easily finish 2. It's probably 50-50 right now, right? We just both lean towards the 50% Mercedes because we know what they're capable of. We know who their drivers are. My biggest reason, aside from, Stroll's performance and all that, Lewis Hamilton and George Russell, I think, can win a race. Fernando Alonso probably can. You know who can't win a race? Lance Stroll. He's not going to win a race.
That's not going to happen.
Now, he is better. We've bagged on him a lot. He's better as a driver. Experience has done well for him, and his car is now awesome versus anything that he's ever had before. He's still not a race winner.
No, if we're putting him on the spectrum of how far up the list he is in terms of current day drivers, I don't know that I put him in the top. I don't think he definitely doesn't end up in the top 10.
Yeah.
No, I'd say he's probably somewhere around 13 or 12, but he's in the 12 spot in a car.
He's got an awesome car.
Exactly. And because of that, and I am giving him credit. I have him at 12, not at 20, not at 19. I think that, to your point, he has done a lot of progressing through his years in F1.
Okay, so those are the big swings. I go Red Bull, Mercedes, Aston Martin, Ferrari, Alpine. Jeremiah goes Red Bull, Mercedes, Aston Martin, Ferrari, McLaren. We're not going to sit here and debate Alpine, McLaren.
They're kind of interchangeable.
They're both underperforming so far this year. And we could do this segment in 2 months, right? And this be completely different than it is right now. But I am not seeing what I thought I'd see out of Alpine, and we're definitely not seeing what we thought we'd see out of McLaren.
Right. So the red flags in this whole section, I guess, of our podcast is definitely going to be the fact that you had Ferrari number 1, I had Ferrari number 2. Ferrari is now number 4 on both of our list. And just for clarification, because I want to bring this point up again, you had Aston Martin at 6. I had them at 4.
Yeah, and I will say, so look, I'm usually the pessimistic, right? I'm leaning towards the negative on a thing. And last year we just ripped Ferrari apart for being horrible and they could have been a champion. And so this season I came into it, I thought, you know what? I'm going to root for Ferrari. I think they're going to do well. They've got the drivers, they've got the car, they changed team principles, and they just stabbed me in the back. I put them at 1 in the Constructors. And they do nothing with it.
Oh my gosh, that is great.
Okay, last segment, a little bit of fun. We pour through the Formula One Reddit page, and we try to find interesting topics or opinions or debates that are going on, because you have comment sections that are 400, 500, 600 comments deep on people that are watching all these races just like us. In the future, we will probably be posting in the Formula One and the Grand Prix Racing Reddit pages, asking for opinions, hot takes, whatever that we can discuss on here. So if you want your username shouted out or something like that, look out for those comment sections. But for this one, we have 3 Reddit posts, all from the past couple of days that we pulled from, and we'll give you the forum they're from and the username and then the kind of title of the article. First thought up for debate is from the_chosen_1. He's real high on himself. His topic was simply early thoughts on the new drivers in new teams. And he listed out 5 of the drivers that have moved teams, and they labeled them how they thought they performed so far. So let's go through the chosen ones list, and then let's kind of talk about that. Nico Hülkenberg obviously comes back to the sport of Formula One. He's been off for 2-3 seasons now.
I thought it was
2019 was the last
4.
one. Yeah, it might be 4. So he comes back and he's running in the Haas team alongside K-Mag. And the chosen one puts performing better than expected. Yeah.
Yes, I will say that. I do want to bring up the fact that you were dogging on this decision to bring Hulkenberg in.
And that's why it's a no-brainer that I'm saying he's performing. But he's got points in a Haas.
Yeah, and I've been sitting here this whole time saying, no, man, I'm telling you, back when he was in the sport, he was doing really good on those midfield teams. And you're like, he's awful.
Okay, I say he's awful. And honestly, I still kind of think he is for the situation that he's in. Whenever we were going back through and watching our predictions episode and all that, right? What was I saying about Nico Hulkenberg? Why is Haas rebuilding with 2 drivers in their 30s? That's not how you rebuild a program. And you also know that Hulkenberg and Magnussen aren't competing for you championships. They're not going to move you up into the top 4 of the Constructors' Championship. That's not the right way to go. So, yes, they might finish 5th, 6th, 7th in the Constructors' Championship. That's not their ultimate goal.
It's not their ultimate goal, but it's better than what they did the previous year, which was their goal.
Right, but to the chosen one's point, Hulkenberg performing a lot better than I think we expected.
Yeah, I definitely would agree on that one. I had him doing really well. I did not have him doing as well as he is doing.
Okay, next one, Pierre Gasly. Where would you put Pierre Gasly this season? He's currently sitting in 14th. He's got 4 points. He's gotten 2 and 2 in the first 2 races of the year. Above, at, or below expectation?
Below, man. Below. He is performing way below the radar of what I had him.
I agree. The chosen one says finishing at expectations. I strongly disagree.
No, I think that with what we saw him doing in that AlphaTauri back when he was on that Red Bull B team
was more impressive.
It was way more impressive. Way more. And he was doing it in a worse car. Now we're talking about him being in a car that was finishing 4th in the Constructors last year and was arguably always in the top 10. I'll go further. Probably always above 9th. I want to say that they were in like 6th through 8th, like almost every race.
Alpine is supposed to be, if you follow, the last 4 years of F1 or whatever, they are supposed to be the 4th best constructor.
Yes.
Which means your drivers are finishing anywhere from 5 or 6 down to 10, right?
Right.
He's in 14th and not looking that great. Now, they were in an okay position in Australia. They took each other out, him and Esteban Ocon. But I think he's way below. And obviously, Alpine messed up with Piastri. They jumped the gun, and Piastri wasn't having it. They could have gone to Daniel Ricciardo.
Yeah, but I don't think Daniel would have gone back to what essentially is Renault.
I think he would have. If you watch Drive to Survive, he was pitching himself to other teams.
Yeah, he was cooking on Renault, but he also left Renault.
Millions of dollars is billions of dollars. Being a Formula One driver versus being a reserve driver, I don't think they care.
Yeah, well, I don't think he cares right now because he's still on that McLaren money. Had to get bought out.
Just getting paid to sit in the Red Bull garage.
He's getting paid to be shown on camera with a serious face and then smile and wave to everybody.
When the Australian Grand Prix is in its 3rd red flag.
He's just sitting there minding his own business. The camera starts zooming in on his face. The whole crowd goes wild.
Okay, so we agree with the Hulkenberg decision on better. We disagree with Gasly. We think he's below expectation. Next on the list, one of the rookies, one of the 3, Oscar Piastri. Signs with McLaren, obviously over the Alpine. The chosen one puts Piastri as expected.
Okay, here's my deal with this one. For one, I kind of feel like he's doing worse, not as expected, but there's a different take to this. Because if we're talking about as expected for the car that he's driving, I'd say that it's probably meeting expectations. But if we're talking about if the McLaren was a decent car, he's performing way under what he should be.
I agree. So he's got 4 points. He's sitting, tied for 11th at this point because there's several drivers with 4 points on the board. Flashback last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago to the McLaren situation. He would be so far underperforming back when they were legitimately competing with Alpine for like the top, 3 or 4 spot in the constructor standings. And I still think he's kind of underperforming. But with what we know about how McLaren is being run, the technical issues that he and Lando have suffered, the craziness that they were involved in the first 2 races, DNFing, and then obviously all the craziness in Australia where he was able to get points. Given all that, he's probably at expectation. Like for him to have 4 points in one race, being new to the sport and being on a horrible McLaren team, all right.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. That's why I said if we're talking about as per what the car should be doing, he's as expected. We talk about him getting a DNF in race 1, going 15th in race 2, and then climbing all the way to 8th in race 3. And now people might say something to the effect of, well, in race 3, we got to see what he was able to do. I disagree, because here again, we have to talk about George Russell DNFing. We have to talk about Charles Leclerc DNFing and both Alpines DNFing. Both Alpines in which they are supposed to be McLaren's equal. And if they're both DNFing, then we just have 2 McLarens in the top 10 and we're not getting accurate results. So I almost want to venture to say we don't know what McLaren has to offer yet. With the DNF in race 1 and with the unnecessarily high finish in race 3, we don't really know what McLaren has to bring.
They shouldn't have had those points in race 3.
No.
Okay, last 2. Logan Sargent, the chosen one, goes with as expected. He's in a Williams, right? So there's not high expectations to begin with. But here's my caveat. I'm going to say below expectation for Logan Sargent.
Whoa.
Here's why. We've seen what the Williams car is capable of. Alex Albon has done well in race. Now, he only has a point, but throughout the course of a race, like if you're looking, the first 2 parts of the race, the first third and the second third, Alex Albon is decent. He's quick. He does well in qualifying. We're not seeing that level from Logan Sargent yet.
No, we saw Logan Sargent finishing 12th in the Bahrain Grand Prix, dropping to 16th in the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And here again, well, actually, no, he was one of the DNFs. He was one of the 8 DNFs in the Australian Grand Prix, knocking him down to 16th, which here again, when you're in the DNFing section, it doesn't really matter where you fall in the points or where you fall in the standings because you DNF'd.
I'd like to see him make a Q3. I'd like to see him be at some point in a race in the top 10, like Alex Albon was in 6th for a long time in Australia. I'd like to see that. Now, again, it's tough. I mean, he's borderline as expecting. Where are you putting him?
I'd say he's about as expecting. I'm not seeing much out of the Williams. I'm not expecting much out of the Williams. However, I do think it's too early to tell because I think we're going to see a lot out of the Azerbaijan Grand Prix.
Yeah.
Now, it does have a lot of technical sections where you'll have some sweeping lefts going into a long right, and you'll have stuff like that. But that back straight and with the Williams speed on straightaways, I want to see him at least finish. I'm going to give him a goal. I want to see Logan Sargent finishing in the top 14.
One of your predictions from before the season, I don't know the right number, but you said somewhere between like he will get points in like 6 races. Is that gonna happen?
Yes, it is.
Come on, man.
We're holding to our guns.
Okay, last one. Nick DeVries, the chosen one on Reddit and the F1 forum, says worse than expected. Yeah.
Yeah. Not much to argue there.
We had such high hopes when he got that Williams into points last year in his first, F1 race as the fill-in driver. He's in the AlphaTauri, which we know is not a good car. They've had their ups, but now they're in a down. I just thought he'd be more productive than doing absolutely nothing.
Yeah, it gets kind of weird because technically he's not doing that bad. We see him finish 14th in the Bahrain Grand Prix. We see him finishing in 14th in the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. And we see him DNFing in the Australian Grand Prix. So if you really look at the standings, 2 14th place finishes shouldn't put him at our 20th spot. But what are you going to do?
Yeah, he's got no points, so he's tied with Logan's. He's tied for 19th.
He's tied.
Tied for 19th. Okay, next topic. This is probably the biggest one, but who finishes second in the Constructors? This is from the Formula One Reddit page by Nick E. Monio. So if you want to look that up, it's just from a couple days ago as of we post this. Who finishes second? Obviously, the battle is between Aston Martin, Ferrari, and Mercedes. We gave our predictions earlier, both of us thinking Mercedes.
Yeah, and there's points that you can make for Ferrari because we could see Ferrari doing Ferrari things where they might start off really bad, but then they come back with a really strong car. They might bring some crazy upgrades that might just bring them into the fight. As it stands right now, they are not in that fight for the number 2 spot.
No, their drivers at Ferrari are still awesome.
Amazing.
They can still have a really good car. They just need to put it all together in a race weekend.
Yeah, and finish the races.
And finish the races. I think right now, obviously, the big battle is Aston Martin and Mercedes. As we see this season unfold, maybe we get the halfway point and we re-update these. But we both lean Mercedes, but I said it earlier, I think it's 50-50 just depending on how it really depends on how far away Lance Stroll is from the pack. That's the wild card.
See, the Mercedes Aston Martin duel is so weird because when you're looking at it, they're both Mercedes powertrains.
Yeah.
Both of them. However, what you're looking at is you're looking at the Mercedes chassis with the Mercedes powertrain, but then you're also looking at the Red Bull chassis with the Mercedes powertrain in Aston Martin. And we're seeing that the Red Bull chassis is just that much better than Mercedes. But here again, I'm going to reiterate because there's been a lot of talk about this lately, and it's getting me excited. I want to see this upgrade package that Mercedes brings. Now, I've been told 5 races into the season. I don't know if that means for the 5th race. I don't know if that means for the 6th race after 5 races have passed. I don't know if it's even 5 races. This is just what I've heard. But they're supposed to be bringing an upgrade package in the beginning of the season in the first few races that's supposed to put them on par with Red Bull.
Last question on this one. If you put Alonso in a Mercedes seat, where is he right now?
Who takes his Aston Martin seat? Because that matters.
Switch him and Lewis Hamilton.
Gosh,
my thought behind the question is the Mercedes car like better than the Aston Martin car, but he's just so dang good?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know because here's the thing: because you look at the backside of that spectrum, and it's Lance Stroll. Now, Lance Stroll is still doing very well, but he is a best of the rest car.
Right.
So, what does that mean for Fernando Alonso? I don't know. I don't know if he's taking something out of that Aston Martin that's just way more than they could have ever imagined, or if it's just a little bit better than that Mercedes car.
Okay, so last topic from Reddit. This is from Jovan Milic 97. This ties back to Australia. The Carlos Sainz 5-second penalty.
Yeah, not a good look for the FIA in my opinion.
So just for backstory before we kind of debate good or bad penalty, Carlos Sainz was in 4th on the second to last restart of the Grand Prix. And they did a standing start, right? So they're on the grid.
Yes.
They go into turn 1, and there's complete chaos, and he cuts off Alonso and pushes Alonso off the track, and it causes the third red flag. There's like a 45-minute gap in them getting everything reset up, and right before he goes back onto the track to do their final lap, which was essentially a formation lap, right? The safety car was going to lead them around, and they were going to go through the checkered flag, and that's your race order. So there's no passing, there's no moving. It's wherever you do that formation lap. Wherever you enter the track is where you're going to finish.
Right.
Right before he drives back on there, they come on his radio, and they said, Carlos, they have given us a 5-second penalty for the collision with Alonso. And he broke down. That man was having a panic attack in the car.
Well, I mean, break this down, because if we look at the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix, something that had nothing to do with that race whatsoever, and we look at how far behind people were, you have Max 5 seconds behind Checo, Fernando Alonso 20 seconds behind Checo, George Russell 25 seconds behind Checo. So let's take that example right there. Fernando Alonso 20 seconds behind Checo, George Russell 25. Now, that's 0.728 for Fernando and 0.866 for George Russell. So if you have a 5-second penalty for Fernando Alonso, he still finishes in 3rd. It's no effect whatsoever. However, when everybody is inches from each other, 5 seconds matters quite a bit.
So that's the kicker in that I think we agree there should have been a penalty. He clearly cut off Alonso, clearly caused him to – he didn't wreck out, but caused him to go off the track. The debate is how they applied the penalty. When you do a 1-lap formation lap through a checkered flag and every car is within 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 seconds of each other, and you now have a 5-second penalty, you go from 3rd or 4th to 12th.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I understand how the process is. I just genuinely believe that if it's going to be this close where everybody's right up on each other's gearbox, don't go with a time penalty. Go with a grid place penalty. Or a position penalty. Yeah. I don't even know if they have things like that. I don't think they do. I think it's all time-based.
This is where it goes back to so it's not the race director that makes all the decisions like when it was Michael Massey making the who can overlap who decision. This is a group of stewards, and they interpret the rules all the same way, and they have a process. I think if you go back to the old way, if there's one guy, I think they could step in and say, hey, look, no penalty, but wherever you are, you're getting 2 or 3 places knocked off. Because in a normal race, like Jeremiah was mentioning earlier when he was given the times from the first 2 races of the year, 5 seconds doesn't lose you 8 spots or 7 spots. It might lose you 1 or 2 if it's a close battle, not out of the points.
Right. Now, if you want to give him a drastic penalty, give him a 5-position penalty.
Right.
Knock him down 5 spots. That still gets him points, and I feel like that's mildly fair. It's still a little bit harsh. Maybe give him a 3-spot penalty, but 5 seconds when everybody is less than half a second away from each other.
And you don't have a racing lap. Even if there was 1 racing lap.
And there's only 12 cars.
Yeah. So I think we both agree with the penalty, but we both disagree with how they do it. Maybe we need to go deep dive into if they've ever done place penalties or things like that.
Yeah, I would like to know what necessarily the rules might have stated back in the day and if any changes were made.
I don't know if that situation, I mean, we heard from the broadcast that clearly that has happened before, that where they do that final lap, formation lap style, and they just end the race. That's had to have happened. Everybody kind of knew that was going to happen. I don't think we knew what was going on when we were watching it, but it seems like there was a process for this. But I don't know if that same situation has happened where you also have a driver in the top 3 or 4 get penalized for 5 seconds and then lose all their points.
No, it's just not something that we want to see.
Okay. That is about all we have for the up-to-date segment for where we sit right now in Formula One. For reference, we're recording this on the 19th of April, so if you are watching this a little bit later and things have changed drastically, sorry. We'll be sure to keep these up to date. Like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be more active on TikTok and on Reddit. We're going to be asking for feedback. So if you happen to come across one of our posts and you have thoughts on a specific topic, or you have an opinion, or you'd like to debate something, let us know. Give us all your thoughts on a topic. Give us your kind of history and background in F1, whatever you feel like you can share with us, and we'll talk about it.
Yes. If you want to give us your hot takes, you can put them on Reddit. Yeah. You can put them on our YouTube channel. Just comment on one of the videos. Hot takes, we will look at those. And if it's funny enough, or if it's controversial enough, or if it's just something that kind of interests both of us, we'll put it in the show. We'll talk about it. We'll even give you a little shout out.
Absolutely. We will be posting on Reddit very soon that we've done this segment, and we'll tag the users that we copied their forums on. But yeah, if you feel the need, or if you want to help out the podcast or be involved in any way, comment below if you're on YouTube, or find us on Reddit or TikTok.
Like, comment, and subscribe.
Absolutely. With that, thanks, guys.
Bye, guys.